1097. The town of Lübeck. The air is thick with the biting chill of a late autumn coming off the Dnieper, a damp cold that clings to the rough-hewn timbers of the fortress and the heavy wool and fur cloaks of the princes gathered within. It is a place pregnant with a fragile, almost unbearable hope. Inside, the low-ceilinged chamber reeks of wood smoke, beeswax, and the nervous sweat of powerful men. This is the stage for a desperate gamble, orchestrated by the one man who still believed the bleeding of RUSs could be stopped, Vladimir Monomakh. You can almost hear the low murmur of cautious greetings, the scrape of benches on the wooden floor, the unnatural quiet of sworn enemies forcing themselves into a shared space. At the center of it all are the grandsons of Yaroslav the Wise, the calculating Grand Prince of Kiev, Sviatopolk, the perpetually aggrieved Oleg of Chernigov, his face a mask of pride and resentment, and Vladimir, his gaze steady, his purpose unbending. To put an end to the endless, ruinous wars over patrimonies, he has forced them to this council, to this one last chance. The climax of the affair is a moment of profound theater. Each prince, one by one, steps forward and kisses a heavy, dark wood cross, their lips touching the cool metal icon as they swear a terrible oath. Let each hold his own patrimony, and if anyone shall rise against another, then the cross shall be against him, and all the land. For a fleeting moment, the flickering torchlight seems to illuminate a new dawn, but the hope is a phantom. The ink on this invisible treaty is not yet dry when the scene shifts to a dark, suffocating chamber in another town. The air here is not filled with hope, but with the metallic tang of pure terror. The victim is Vasilko of Terebovel, one of the princes from the council, now a captive. We do not need to see the faces of his captors, for they are the faces of this era's ambition. We hear the muffled struggle, the grunts of exertion, the low, chilling words of a sentence being passed, not in a court, but in a dungeon. The true sound is the inhuman hum of a man's spirit breaking, the sound of a scream that cannot fully escape the throat. The deed is done with a shepherd's knife, a crude instrument for an act of medieval statecraft. Vasilko is blinded. The light of the world is extinguished for him, and with it, the fragile light of the Lübeck Congress. This single act of calculated savagery, committed by his own cousins against a man he had just sworn to protect, revealed the true, hellish nature of the world Monomakh was trying to tame, and it would become the crucible in which his entire philosophy of power and mercy would be forged. This is the narrative of him, Vladimir Vsevolodovich, known to history by the thunderous echo of his Byzantine grandfather's name, Monomakh, the one who fights alone. This was the saga of the quintessential warrior prince of the RUS, a man whose life was a litany of campaigns. The chronicles claim 83 major military endeavors, a number that numbs the mind with its sheer scale of violence and exertion. He was a man who lived in the saddle, who knew the weight of a mail shirt in the summer heat and the sting of frozen leather against his skin in the winter. He knew the chaotic symphony of a battle, the roar of 1,000 throats, the sickening thud of an axe finding bone, the high-pitched screaming of wounded horses. He was a product of a savage age, a player in the brutal Game of Thrones, where kinship was as often a cause for murder as it was for alliance. And yet, this is the man who in the winter of his life sits down not to write a chronicle of his glorious victories, but a quiet, deeply personal text for his children, the Pouchini, the instruction. This is the central dramatic paradox of his existence. The hardened general, the pragmatic politician who had starved cities and put enemies to the sword, becomes the author of a code of mercy. He instructs his sons, Above all, have no pride in your heart or in your mind. Do not allow the powerful to destroy a man. Do not kill either the righteous or the guilty. Take special care of the poor, the orphan, and the widow. How does this happen? What alchemy of the soul, what political calculation, what profound weariness could transform a wolf of the battlefield into a shepherd of his people? Was it a deathbed conversion, a desperate plea for salvation from a man whose hands were stained with a lifetime of blood? Or was it something else entirely? The ultimate strategic gambit from a master statesman who had come to understand a truth his rivals could not grasp. To answer this question, we must journey back into the heart of his violent world, a world teetering on a knife's edge, to understand how a man forged in the crucible of endless war came to preach the gospel of forgiveness as the only path to survival. To understand this man, we must return to the world of the late 11th century, a geopolitical chessboard drenched in blood and uncertainty. This was not a world of stable empires and clear borders. It was a fractured, violent landscape. To the far west, the aftershocks of the Norman conquest of England were still reshaping the political map, while in the heart of Europe, the titanic struggle between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, the investiture controversy, was tearing Christendom apart. These were distant storms, their thunder heard only faintly in the forests of the RUS. The powers that mattered to Kiev were closer, more immediate, and far more dangerous. To the south lay the magnificent, decaying heart of Orthodox civilization, the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople, the city, was a beacon of culture, faith, and immense wealth, but it was an empire under siege, bleeding territory to the Seljuk Turks in the east and the Normans in the west. For Rus, Byzantium was a spiritual mother, the source of its religion, its art, and its very conception of political legitimacy. Monomach's own mother was a Byzantine princess, a living link to this imperial grandeur. But it was also a fading power, a brilliant sunset that offered more inspiration than actual protection. The true existential threat did not come from the west or the south, but from the east. There lay the boundless, oceanic expanse of the Great Steppe, and its masters were the Polovtsians, or Cumans. They were the terror of the Rus frontier, a whirlwind of nomadic horsemen whose lightning raids could strip a region bare in a matter of weeks, carrying off wealth, livestock, and thousands of people into slavery. The dreaded Polon. The steppe was a constant, pressing reality, a force of nature that shaped every aspect of Rus's life, from its military tactics to its political alliances. And within this vice, squeezed between a decaying empire and a predatory steppe, the land of the Rus was itself not a kingdom, but a patchwork quilt of warring principalities, a loose federation of city-states, governed by the sprawling, feuding clan of the Rurikids. They were all cousins, all descendants of the great Yaroslav the Wise, but their shared blood did nothing to temper their savage ambitions. This was the world that Vladimir Monomakh was born into, a land with no secure borders, no central authority, and no lasting peace, a civilization under constant threat from without and perpetually tearing itself apart from within. The character of Vladimir Monomakh was forged in the crucible of a unique and powerful duality, a heritage that made him an outsider in his own land, even as it destined him for greatness. He was born from the union of two worlds. His father was Vsevolod Yaroslavich, a son of the great Kievan prince Yaroslav the Wise, a pure-blood Rurikid, a man of the northern forests, steeped in the traditions of Viking warrior princes and Slavic statecraft. But his mother was no local princess. She was, according to the chronicles, a daughter of the Byzantine Emperor Constantine IX Monomachos, a woman raised in the marble halls of Constantinople, the epicenter of Christian civilization, a place of intricate court ceremony, deep theological debate, and 1,000 years of Roman law and diplomacy. This single fact of his birth set Vladimir apart from all his cousins. While they were purely of the RUS, he carried within him the blood of emperors, the legacy of both the raw, violent energy of the Varangian north and the sophisticated, ancient wisdom of the Hellenic south. This was both his greatest gift and his ancestral curse. It gave him a breadth of vision his rivals lacked. He could think not just as a prince of Pereyaslav or Chernigov, but as an inheritor of a grander tradition. He was literate, fluent in several languages, and deeply versed in Orthodox scripture, possessing an intellectual depth that was rare among the warrior elite of Kiev. Yet it also marked him. His very name, Monomakh, was a foreign import, a constant reminder of his exotic bloodline. He had to prove, over and over again, that he was as fierce a warrior, as dedicated a defender of the RUS's land as any of his purely Slavic cousins. His youth was not a sheltered upbringing in the golden-domed Kiev. It was a relentless apprenticeship in the brutal realities of his world, a trial by fire designed to burn away any trace of Constantinopolitan softness and forge him into a Rurikid prince worthy of his father's legacy. This internal conflict, the soul of a Byzantine scholar trapped in the body of a RUS's warlord, would define his entire life, fueling both his military genius and his unprecedented, almost revolutionary, search for a more just and merciful form of rule. His first steps into the great game were not taken on the polished floors of a royal court, but in the mud and blood of the Kievan Rus's most dangerous frontier. His father, Vsevolod, granted him the rule of the distant city of Rostov in the northeast, a land of dense forests and pagan tribes, but his true political and military education began when he was moved to the volatile principality of Chernigov. Chernigov was the anvil of the RUS. It was a borderland principality, one of the most powerful and prestigious after Kiev, but it was also directly in the path of the Polovtsian hordes. It was a land of constant, low-grade warfare, a place where a prince slept with a sword by his bed, and where the smoke of burning villages on the horizon was a common sight. It was here, as a young man, that Monomakh learned the grim arithmetic of survival. He learned how to lead a druzhina, a prince's personal warband, on lightning-fast counter-raids. He learned how to read the tracks of a Polovtsian scouting party, how to choose the ground for a battle, how to rally his men when their nerve was about to break. The chronicles record his first campaigns as a teenager, a relentless cycle of patrols and skirmishes that blurred into one another. This was not the glorious, chivalric warfare of Western European ballads. This was a desperate, grinding struggle for existence. He lived for years in the saddle, sharing the simple food and harsh conditions of his soldiers. This experience forged an unbreakable bond with his warriors, but it also instilled in him a profound and abiding hatred for war itself. He saw firsthand the cost of the fighting, the burned-out villages, the fields gone to seed, the faces of women whose husbands and sons had been killed or dragged off into slavery. More than anything, he saw the devastating consequences of the prince's own feuds. While he was bleeding on the frontier to hold back the Polovtsians, his own cousins were often plotting against each other, sometimes even making treacherous alliances with the nomads to attack a rival's land. It was in the endless, thankless defense of Chernigov that the core of his political philosophy was born. A burning conviction that the greatest threat to the land of RUS was not the Polovtsian in the steppe, but the Rurikid prince in the neighboring castle. Beneath the surface of the skilled commander and the shrewd diplomat lay a hidden, driving force, an inner motivation that was far more complex than a simple thirst for power or glory. While his cousins schemed for richer cities and grander titles, Monomakh was possessed by a different kind of ambition, one that was almost spiritual in its intensity. His secret demon was not greed, but a crushing, almost suffocating sense of personal responsibility for the abstract concept of the Ruskaya Zemlya, the land of the Rus. To him, this was not just a collection of feuding principalities on a map. It was a sacred inheritance, a single orthodox realm united by a common faith, language, and dynasty, a domain entrusted to his family by God himself. He saw his cousin's endless squabbles not merely as political maneuvering, but as a deep, sacrilegious betrayal of this sacred trust. Every internecine war was a stab wound in the body of the land. Every drop of Rus blood shed by another Rus was a victory for the pagan Polovtsians and, in a deeper sense, for the forces of chaos and darkness. This worldview transformed his personal ambition into a holy mission. He was not fighting to make himself the most powerful prince. He was fighting to save the soul of his nation. This explains the almost obsessive energy he brought to his campaigns and his diplomacy. The chronicles speak of him undertaking incredible journeys, riding hundreds of miles in just a few days to broker a peace or to lead a surprise attack. This was a man driven by a restless, anxious energy, a man who felt the weight of his entire civilization on his shoulders. This inner burden also explains his moments of profound weariness, the deep melancholy that can be felt in his writings. He was a man who loved peace, but was condemned to spend his entire life at war. His greatest enemy was not the Polovtsian Khans, but the very nature of his own kin, the destructive, centrifugal force of Rurikid pride and ambition. His struggle was not just to defeat his enemies on the battlefield, but to conquer the inner demon of his own clan's self-destruction. In the grand, tragic theater of 11th century Rus's politics, every hero is defined by his antagonist, and for Vladimir Monomakh, that figure was his own cousin, Oleg of Chernigov. Their relationship was the central, agonizing drama of Monomakh's political life, a rivalry that was both deeply personal and profoundly symbolic. Oleg, nicknamed Gorislavich by a later chronicler, meaning of the sorrowful glory, was in many ways Monomakh's dark mirror. He too was a grandson of Yaroslav the Wise, a prince of immense personal bravery and charisma. But where Monomakh was driven by the idea of collective security for the Rus land, Oleg was consumed by a burning sense of personal grievance. He believed he had been cheated of his rightful patrimony, the city of Chernigov, which had been held by his father, and he was willing to do anything to get it back. This single-minded obsession made him a dangerously unpredictable force. Oleg was the embodiment of the old way of thinking, the principle of clan-based, personal right above all else. If it meant allying himself with the hated Polovtsians and unleashing them on his cousin's lands to reclaim what he saw as his, then so be it. Their fateful encounter was not a single meeting, but a lifelong, grinding conflict that ebbed and flowed across the political landscape. They were rivals, then temporary allies, then bitter enemies once more. The conflict came to a head when Monomakh was the ruling prince in Chernigov. Oleg, with a host of Polovtsian allies, marched on the city. This was the ultimate test of Monomakh's nascent philosophy. He had the stronger position, a loyal army, and the support of the citizens. He could have fought, and he likely would have won, but he also knew the price of that victory: a sacked city, countless deaths, and a new, even more vicious cycle of revenge. The encounter that truly defined his path was not one of swords, but of a profound, agonizing choice that would set him apart from all his peers. It was this crucible of rivalry with Oleg that forced Monomakh to evolve from a mere warrior into a statesman, a man who would ultimately have to decide what he was willing to sacrifice: his city, his honor, his pride, for the sake of a greater peace. The first great test of Monomakh's revolutionary philosophy arrived with the siege of Chernigov in the year 1094. His sworn enemy, Oleg, stood before the city walls, not with a RUS's army, but with a horde of Polovtsian cavalry, his allies of convenience. Inside the city, Monomakh had everything he needed for a conventional victory. The walls were strong, his drugina was loyal and battle-hardened, and the citizens, who revered him, were ready to fight to the last man. The traditional Rurikid code of conduct demanded only one course of action: to fight. To surrender a city, especially one's rightful patrimony, was an act of unthinkable shame. It was a declaration of weakness that could permanently damage a prince's reputation and invite further attacks. All of Monomakh's warrior instincts, all the traditions of his ancestors, screamed at him to arm his men and meet Oleg in the field. But as he looked out from the city walls, he saw not a glorious battle to be won, but a vision of the abyss. He saw the smoke of burning suburbs. He heard the imagined screams of the citizens who would be slaughtered. He saw the faces of the women and children who would be dragged away into the steppe by Oleg's pagan allies. And he saw the ultimate futility of it all. A victory would solve nothing. It would only deepen the blood feud, ensuring that his and Oleg's sons, and their sons after them, would continue this pointless, self-devouring war. In that moment, he made a decision that was utterly incomprehensible to his contemporaries. He chose to accept shame to prevent a catastrophe. He sent a message to Oleg, a message that is echoed through the chronicles. "I will not boast or say, I will drive you out, but I will not rejoice in the shedding of Christian blood." He voluntarily surrendered the city of his father, and with his family and a small retinue, walked out of the gates, effectively entering into political exile. This act of apparent weakness was, in reality, his first great victory. He had refused to play by the old, bloody rules. He had paid the price of power not with the lives of his people, but with his own personal pride, seizing a moral high ground that made him a figure of immense respect and authority, even in defeat. The great antagonist of Monomakh's saga, the force against which he measured himself and his entire civilization, was not a single man like Oleg, but a vast and powerful entity, the Polovtsian steppe. To the settled, agricultural, and Christian society of the RUS, the Polovtsians, also known as the Cumans, were more than just an enemy. They were the embodiment of a terrifyingly alien world. They were a Turkic nomadic people who had swept into the Pontic steppe in the 11th century, displacing the Pechenegs and establishing a vast, loosely organized empire, a khanate that stretched from the Danube to the Volga. They were masters of the horse and the composite bow, the ultimate light cavalry of their age. Their society was tribal, their religion shamanistic, and their way of life was inextricably linked to the boundless, grassy plains they called the wild field. Their entire economy was based on pastoralism and, crucially, on raiding. For the Polovtsians, a raid on the RUS borderlands was not an act of wanton destruction. It was a form of economic harvest. They sought not to conquer and occupy the RUS's principalities, but to bleed them, to carry off slaves, livestock, and portable wealth before vanishing back into the endless expanse of the steppe. This made them an infuriatingly difficult enemy to fight. A RUS's army, with its heavy infantry and knightly drugina, was slow and ponderous compared to the whirlwind mobility of a Polovtsian horde. They would strike where they were least expected and refuse to give battle on any terms but their own. But they were not mindless barbarians. They had a complex political structure of clans and khans, a rich artistic culture, and a shrewd understanding of Rus's politics. They were masters of diplomacy, willing to sell their services as mercenaries to any Rurikid prince willing to pay their price, as Oleg so often did. Monomakh understood that the Polovtsians were not merely a military problem, they were a civilizational one. They were a mirror image of the RUS, a society that thrived on mobility and decentralization, and they preyed on the RUS' greatest weakness, their internal disunity. He realized that as long as the RUS princes fought each other, the steppe would always win, bleeding them one by one until nothing was left. Every great leader is shaped by a moment of catastrophic failure, a crucible of defeat that burns away arrogance and forges a new understanding of the world. For Vladimir Monomakh, that moment came in the year 1093 at the battle on the Stugna River. Following the death of his father, the Grand Prince Vsevolod, a coalition of Polovtsian Khans, saw an opportunity in the ensuing political instability and launched a massive invasion. Monomakh, along with his cousin Sviatopolk, the new Grand Prince of Kiev, and his own brother Rostislav, gathered their forces to meet the threat. Monomakh, already a seasoned commander, advised caution. He argued for a defensive strategy to hold their position behind the river and let the Polovtsians exhaust themselves. But the other princes, full of youthful arrogance and eager for glory, overruled him. They chose to cross the river and attack the Polovtsian host directly. The result was an unmitigated disaster. The sensory assault of the battle was one of pure chaos and terror. The vast, open plain gave the Polovtsian horse archers a decisive advantage. They swarmed the RUS's flanks, a cloud of arrows that darkened the sky, a high-pitched, ululating cry that unnerved the soldiers. The RUS's lines broke. The retreat turned into a panicked rout. The princes fled back towards the river, a torrent of terrified men and horses. The Stugna, swollen by recent rains, became a death trap. Monomakh, fighting a desperate rearguard action, watched in horror as his younger brother, Rostislav, weighed down by his armor, was thrown from his horse and swallowed by the icy, churning water. Monomakh himself barely escaped. The defeat was total, but the true breaking point was the personal loss of his brother, a death he felt directly responsible for. He had allowed himself to be overruled, had bowed to the reckless pride of his cousins. The icy water of the Stugna extinguished more than his brother's life. It extinguished Monomakh's faith in the traditional Rurikid model of command, by consensus among equals. He understood in that moment of bitter grief and humiliation that valor was useless, and courage was a liability if it was not guided by a single, unified, and cautious will. Unity was no longer a political preference. It was the only key to survival. Out of the ashes of the Stugna defeat and the moral bankruptcy revealed by the blinding of Vasilko, Vladimir Monomakh found his opportunity to transform the very political grammar of the RUS. He realized that appeals to kinship and oaths upon the cross were meaningless. The only language the fractious princes understood was fear and self-interest. The catalyst came in the year 1103. Two powerful Polovtsian Khans were once again planning a major raid, and the threat of another devastating invasion hung over the southern principalities like a shroud. This time, Monomakh did not wait to be attacked. He conceived of a plan that was as audacious as it was unprecedented, not to defend the borders, but to gather a unified army of all the major princes and launch a massive, preemptive strike deep into the Polovtsian heartland. To achieve this, he called a meeting of the princes at Dolobsk Lake. It was here that he demonstrated his genius for psychological manipulation. The Grand Prince Sviatopolk, still scarred by the Stugna and other defeats, was hesitant. His personal Druzhina argued against the campaign, pointing out that it was springtime, and to call up the peasant levies would ruin the planting season. This was the moment of truth. The old Monomakh might have debated strategy. The new Monomakh went for the jugular. According to the Chronicle, he delivered a speech that was a masterpiece of emotional blackmail and political theater. He turned to Sviatopolk and said, "I see that you feel pity for the peasants and their horses, but do you not feel pity for what will happen to them in the summer? The peasant will go out to plow, the Polovtsian will come, shoot him with an arrow, take his horse and his wife, and burn his village. Do you not feel pity for that?" It was a devastatingly effective argument. He shamed the other princes into action by painting a vivid, terrifying picture of the consequences of their inaction. He made the choice not between war and peace, but between a controlled, offensive war on their own terms and a defensive, chaotic war fought in their own burning fields. He forged unity not through appeals to a shared heritage, but by harnessing their shared terror. The princes agreed. For the first time, a truly pan-Russ's army was assembled, not to fight another prince, but to take the fight to the steppe. It was an army born of chaos, but it was an army united by his will. The great campaign of the year 1111 stands as the absolute zenith of Vladimir Monomach's military career, the moment his audacious strategy of unified action was vindicated in the most spectacular fashion. This was not just another punitive raid. It was conceived and executed as a holy war, a RUS crusade into the heart of the pagan steppe. Monomakh assembled a colossal army, drawing troops from nearly all the major principalities. This steel avalanche of tens of thousands of men, including heavy infantry and the princely cavalry, moved out in the early spring, a season when the nomadic horses were at their weakest after a long winter. The spiritual dimension of the campaign was deliberately emphasized. Priests marched with the soldiers, carrying icons and chanting prayers. Monomakh was framing this not as a war for plunder, but as a righteous struggle for the defense of Christendom. After a grueling march of several weeks, the RUS's host penetrated deeper into Polovtsian territory than any army had ever dared to go before. They stormed and sacked several Polovtsian cities, finally forcing the main Polovtsian army, a massive concentration of nomadic horsemen, to give battle on the banks of the Salnitsa River. The ensuing clash was a hellish forge of violence on an epic scale. The sensory assault was overwhelming. The sky was a dark cloud of arrows. The earth shook under the hooves of tens of thousands of horses, and the air was filled with the deafening roar of battle cries in a dozen different dialects. The Polovtsians fought with desperate ferocity, but for once, they could not use their hit-and-run tactics. They were pinned against the river, forced into a brutal close-quarters melee against the heavier RUS's infantry and armored cavalry. Monomakh, fighting in the center of the line, directed the battle with a master's hand. The discipline of the unified RUS's army held. The Polovtsian lines shattered. The defeat turned into a massacre. The victory was absolute and devastating. The power of the Polovtsian hordes on the Don River was broken for a generation. The news of the triumph on the Salnitsa spread throughout the Christian world, even being recorded in the annals of the Byzantine Empire. For the people of Rus, it was a miracle. For Vladimir Monomakh, it was the ultimate proof that his life's work, his obsessive quest for unity, was not a mad dream, but the only true path to salvation for his land. At the summit of his power, in the immediate aftermath of the Salnitsa victory, we must try to enter the mind of Vladimir Monomakh. This was his moment of greatest triumph, a victory that dwarfed any achieved by his ancestors, including the great Yaroslav the Wise. A lesser man would have been consumed by hubris, by the intoxicating belief in his own invincibility. And indeed, a form of hubris did take root in Monomakh. but it was of a unique and dangerous kind. He did not see the victory as a testament to his personal genius alone. Instead, he viewed it as a sign of divine approval, a clear and unambiguous message from God that his path, his philosophy of enforced unity, was the correct one. He saw himself not as a conqueror, but as an instrument of a divine plan to protect the Orthodox RUS from the pagan darkness. This belief, while a source of immense strength, was also a psychological trap. It solidified his conviction that he, and he alone, understood what was necessary for the survival of his people. If unity was God's will, then any prince who opposed that unity, any cousin who clung to his petty, selfish ambitions, was not just a political rival. He was an obstacle to the divine order, a heretic against the sacred cause of the RUS land. This psychology of triumph transformed him from a first among equals, a clever broker of alliances, into a man who believed he had a mandate from heaven to impose his will upon others. His subsequent actions were all colored by this conviction. He no longer sought consensus, he demanded obedience. He no longer negotiated with his rivals, he issued ultimatums. The man who had once voluntarily given up the city of Chernigov to avoid bloodshed would later use the threat of overwhelming force to bring lesser princes to heel. His hubris was not the simple pride of a warrior, but the far more perilous pride of a righteous zealot, a man who has come to believe that his own political agenda is synonymous with the will of God himself. This was the moment the peacemaker began to fully embrace the tools of the autocrat, convinced he was doing so for the greater good. To truly understand the depth of Monomach's political philosophy, we must look at his most personal and enduring conflict, the lifelong rivalry with Oleg of Chernigov. A remarkable historical accident allows us to peer directly into the heart of their relationship. A letter, preserved in the chronicles, sent from Monomach to Oleg. It is one of the most extraordinary documents of the era, a raw and intimate glimpse into the mind of a medieval ruler. The letter was written after Oleg, in one of his campaigns, had killed Monomach's own son, Izyaslav. By all the codes of that time, the blood feud between them should now have been absolute and eternal. Revenge was not just an option, it was a sacred duty. And yet, the letter Monomach writes is not a declaration of war, but a staggering plea for peace and reconciliation. He begins by acknowledging his profound grief. "My son is dead, and you are alive. I would not have wished you ill." But then, he pivots from personal sorrow to the greater tragedy of their endless conflict. He reminds Oleg of their shared Christian faith, of the last judgment they will both have to face. And then comes the most remarkable passage, the core of his worldview. He offers Oleg not vengeance, but forgiveness, and he offers him a political settlement that is astonishing in its generosity. He essentially says, "Take the patrimony you claim, rule it, but let us stop this endless, pointless shedding of Christian blood that only benefits our enemies." He appeals to Oleg's reason, his faith, his sense of shared kinship, everything but his pride. This letter reveals the true nature of Monomach's chemistry with his sworn enemy. He saw Oleg not as a monster, but as a tragic figure, a man consumed by a grievance that was poisoning the entire land. Monomach's response to the murder of his son was not to reach for his sword, but for his pen, to try, one last time, to use the logic of mercy as a tool of statecraft. The letter is the ultimate proof that his later instruction was not a product of old age, but the culmination of a philosophy forged and tested over a lifetime of dealing with men like Oleg, men for whom personal honor was worth more than the lives of thousands. While Monomach's fame rests on his military victories, his most lasting contribution to the RUSs may have been what he did during the rare moments of peace. He was not just a warrior, he was a builder, and most importantly, a teacher. His greatest construction was not a fortress or a church, but a text, the Pushini, or the Instruction to My Children. This document is unique in the literature of medieval Europe. It is not a formal law code like the Justinian Code, nor is it a grand epic like the Song of Roland. It is an intensely personal and practical work, a combination of autobiography, a prince's handbook, and a moral testament. It is here, in his own words, that we see the warrior wrestling with the demands of his Christian conscience. The text is a blend of hard-won battlefield pragmatism and profound spiritual reflection. He advises his sons on the practicalities of rule. In your journeys, do not rely on your attendants, but look after everything yourselves. He stresses the importance of personal diligence and warns against the temptations of drink and laziness. He gives detailed advice on military matters, drawing on his own vast experience. But woven throughout this practical advice is a radical and consistent ethical message. He repeatedly urges his sons to show mercy. He tells them, based on his reading of the Psalms, to not contend with evildoers, nor envy the wicked. In a particularly striking passage, he commands them, "Wherever you go in your lands, give the poor to drink and to eat, and have a special care for the stranger and the orphan and the widow, and do not let the powerful destroy a man." This was not the standard rhetoric of a medieval warlord. This was a call for a kind of social justice, a recognition that the true strength of a prince lay not in the number of enemies he had killed, but in the security and well-being of the weakest of his subjects. The Pushini was Monomakh's attempt to build a moral framework for power, to codify the lessons he had learned in a lifetime of violence. It was his desperate effort to ensure that the fragile peace he had won on the battlefield would not be immediately squandered by a new generation of prideful, feuding princes. The world of Vladimir Monomakh was far more interconnected than is often imagined, and the context of his family life reveals the deep international currents that shaped his reign. His court was not an isolated Slavic outpost, but a crossroads of European dynastic politics. This is most vividly illustrated by his first and most influential wife, Geitha of Wessex. Her story is a remarkable epic in its own right. She was the daughter of Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, the man who defeated a Viking invasion at Stamford Bridge, only to be killed by the Normans at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Geitha was a royal princess who became a refugee. Along with her brothers, she fled the Norman conquest, escaping first to Denmark and eventually finding her way to the court of Kiev. Her marriage to the young Vladimir Monomakh was a strategic alliance, but it had profound cultural implications. Through Geitha, the blood of the ancient kings of Wessex flowed into the Rurikid dynasty. Her presence in Kiev brought with her the stories, the traditions, and the political perspectives of the Anglo-Saxon world. It served as a constant reminder that the Norman conquest of England and the Plovdian raids on RUSs were part of the same violent, shifting landscape of 11th century Europe. This connection broadened Monomakh's horizons, embedding his own struggles within a larger pan-European narrative of conquest, exile, and the fight for survival. His sons, therefore, were not just Rurikids, they were the descendants of English kings and Byzantine emperors. One of them, Mstislav the Great, would continue this tradition of international alliances by marrying a Swedish princess. This web of connections influenced Monomakh's decisions in countless ways. It reinforced his sense of himself as a major European monarch, not just a regional warlord. It gave him access to diplomatic channels and intelligence from across the continent. Most importantly, It enriched the cultural and intellectual life of his court, creating an environment where a document as sophisticated and humane as the Pushani could be conceived and written. For decades, Vladimir Monomakh had focused his immense energies on the two great threats to the Rus's land: the external danger of the Polovtsians and the internal danger of princely feuds. He had achieved remarkable success against both. But in the year 1113, a new and far more unpredictable storm broke, and it came from a direction he had never anticipated: from the streets of Kiev itself. The crisis was triggered by the death of the Grand Prince Sviatopolk II. Sviatopolk's reign had been marked by corruption, and his officials had allowed rampant predatory lending, particularly by the Jewish community, which had driven many artisans and commoners into ruinous debt. Upon his death, the simmering resentment of the Kievan populace exploded into open revolt. The Kiev uprising was a terrifying spectacle. The sensory assault was one of urban chaos: the roar of an angry mob, the splintering of doors being kicked in, the smell of smoke as the houses of hated officials and moneylenders were set ablaze. This was not an army of nomads or a rival prince's drugina. This was the common people, the plebs, rising up in a wave of uncontrolled fury. The city's elite, the boyars and wealthy merchants, were thrown into a panic. Their own militias could not contain the riot. The entire social order seemed to be on the verge of collapse. This was the first major crack in the edifice Monomakh had worked so hard to build. He had secured the land from foreign enemies, but he had not solved the deep-seated social injustices within it. The uprising was an ominous portent, a harbinger of a new kind of threat. It demonstrated that a state could be destroyed not just by swords from the outside, but by decay and desperation from within. The panicked Kievan elite, seeing their city burn and their power evaporate, took a desperate step. They sent a delegation to Vladimir Monomakh, who was then ruling in Pereyaslav, and begged him to come and take the throne of the Grand Prince. The offer was the culmination of his life's ambition, but it was an offer born of terror and chaos, a crown being offered to him by men who feared their own people more than they feared his power. The invitation to take the throne of Kiev in 1113 was the single most fateful moment of Vladimir Monomakh's life, the point of no return, where he transitioned from being the most powerful of the Rus's princes to being its undisputed master. His decision to accept was not a simple act of ambition. It was a profound, psychological and political calculation. He was an old man by the standards of his day, already in his 60s. He could have refused. He could have remained in his secure principality of Pereyaslav, letting Kiev burn, letting the other princes squabble over the ruined prize, content in the knowledge that his own lands were safe. This would have been the cautious path. But Monomakh saw the uprising not just as a crisis, but as the ultimate opportunity. He understood the psychology of the moment perfectly. The Kievan boyars, the wealthy elite who had so often resisted attempts to centralize power, were now terrified. They had looked into the abyss of social revolution and were willing to accept any ruler who could restore order. They were not just offering him a crown, they were offering him a mandate to rule with an iron hand. He accepted the throne not as a seizure of power, but as a reluctant acceptance of a sacred duty. At least, that is how he framed it. He entered Kiev not as a conqueror, but as a savior. His first acts were a masterclass in statecraft. He immediately enacted a series of reforms, a charter that limited the interest rates charged by moneylenders, addressing the primary grievance of the mob. This pacified the common people. He then used his immense military authority to crush the last vestiges of the riot, restoring order to the streets. This reassured the elite. In one swift series of moves, he had both calmed the popular rage and cemented his alliance with the aristocracy. But the psychological error, if it can be called that, was in his embrace of this new role. He had been invited to save the state from chaos, and he came to believe that only his personal autocratic rule could permanently keep that chaos at bay. The fateful act was not just accepting the throne, but accepting the underlying premise that the people were a dangerous mob and the princes were greedy fools, and that only he, Monomakh, possessed the wisdom and strength to hold the entire fragile structure together. The greatest catastrophe of Vladimir Monomach's career was not a military defeat, but a profound moral and political failure that exposed the ultimate futility of his quest for a stable, consensus-based order. This catastrophe was the immediate, brutal aftermath of his greatest diplomatic achievement, the Lübeck Congress of 1097. He had invested all of his political capital and moral authority into that council. He had cajoled, persuaded, and pressured his warring cousins to come together and swear a sacred oath on the cross to end their fratricidal wars. The principle they agreed upon, let each hold his own patrimony, was revolutionary. It was meant to be the foundation stone of a new, peaceful order. Monomakh must have left Lübeck with a sense of weary but profound satisfaction. He had, he believed, finally managed to chain the beast of Rurikid ambition. The news of what happened next must have struck him like a physical blow. Just days after the Congress, two of the princes, David Igorovich and Sviatopolk of Kiev, conspired to seize another prince, Vasilko of Terebovel, a participant at the council. They lured him to a supposed meeting, captured him, and in an act of shocking barbarity had him blinded. The sheer, calculated cruelty of the act was staggering. But for Monomakh, the true horror was the political implication. This was not a crime committed in the heat of battle. It was a premeditated act of political terror that directly repudiated the oath they had all just sworn. It was a declaration that in the world of the RUS, a solemn vow before God was worthless when weighed against a parcel of land. This was Monomach's greatest catastrophe because it proved that his entire project was built on sand. He had believed that reason, shared faith, and a common threat could bind the princes together. The blinding of Vasilko proved him wrong. It revealed a core of savage, nihilistic ambition in his kin that could not be tamed by treaties or oaths. It was the moment he understood that peace could not be negotiated. It had to be imposed. The moral catastrophe was the death of his hope for a voluntary federation of princes, and the birth of his conviction that the only solution was a single, unchallengeable authority, his own. The blinding of Vasilko marked the definitive collapse of Monomach's early idealism and forced upon him a final, stark choice. The dream of a RUS united by brotherly love and conciliar agreement was dead, shattered by the cruel political realities of his age. In its place was a new, much harsher vision. He saw now that the centrifugal forces of princely ambition were not a flaw in the system. They were the system itself. Left to their own devices, his cousins would always choose personal gain over the common good, tearing the land apart in their endless squabbles until there was nothing left for the Polovtsians to burn. The psychological shift within him was profound. The weary diplomat who had pleaded for peace at Lübeck was replaced by a grimly determined enforcer. His last chance, and the last chance for the RUS land as he saw it, was to abandon the quest for consensus and embrace the lonely burden of autocracy. He would no longer be the first among equals. He would be the master. He would use the immense moral authority he had accumulated, backed by the most powerful army in the land, to crush any opposition to his will. The years after the Kiev uprising, when he reigned as Grand Prince, were the ultimate expression of this new philosophy. He did not rule by committee. He placed his own sons in control of the key cities, Novgorod, Smolensk, Rostov, turning the loose federation of principalities into a tightly controlled family enterprise. When other princes dared to challenge his authority, his response was swift and overwhelming. He did not negotiate. He mobilized his armies and forced them into submission. He became the sole guarantor of stability, the single pole around which the entire political world of the RUS now revolved. This was his last, desperate gamble, to hold the fracturing world together through the sheer force of his personal will. He had tried to build a house of peace on the foundation of a treaty, and it had collapsed. Now, he would rebuild it on the only foundation he had left to trust, his own absolute power. It was a tragic transformation, but in the brutal calculus of the 12th century, it may have been the only choice that could have saved the RUSes from total disintegration. The finale of the warrior who preached forgiveness came not in the sound and fury of a last battle, but in the profound quiet of a dynasty secured and a realm at peace. Vladimir Monomakh died in the spring of the year 1125 at his country estate near Kiev. He was 72 years old, an almost biblical age for a man who had spent his entire life on campaign. His end was not the violent demise of a warlord, struck down by an enemy's blade. It was the peaceful passing of a patriarch, surrounded by the sons he had meticulously placed in positions of power across the vast expanse of the RUS lands. The cinematic scene of his final days is not one of drama, but of order. We can imagine the old prince, his body finally failing him after a lifetime of unimaginable exertion, dictating the final passages of his instruction to a scribe, his voice, now thinned by age, still firm with the weight of authority and experience. He had outlived them all, the ambitious Sviatopolk, the bitter Oleg, the treacherous David. He had fought the Polovtsians to a standstill, securing his southern borders for a generation. He had unified the RUS under his single, unquestioned authority, creating a period of stability and prosperity that later chroniclers would look back upon as a golden age. His last act was not to conquer a new city or defeat a new enemy, but to ensure a smooth succession, passing the throne of the Grand Prince to his eldest son, Mstislav the Great, a man he had carefully groomed to continue his life's work. The circumstances of his end were the ultimate, ironic vindication of his philosophy. The man who had witnessed so much chaos and bloodshed died peacefully in his bed because he had been willing to use ruthless, autocratic means to achieve a state of order. His story had come full circle. The young prince who had learned the hard lessons of war on the frontiers of Chernigov had become the unchallenged father of his nation, leaving behind not just a kingdom, but a powerful and deeply paradoxical testament on the nature of power, war, and mercy. The legacy of Vladimir Monomakh is a battlefield of conflicting interpretations, a testament to the profound and enduring complexity of his character and his reign. For generations of Russian historians, particularly those writing under the shadow of the centralized Muscovite state and later the Russian Empire, Monomakh was the ideal. He was the quintessential Sobiratel Ruskich Zemel, the gatherer of the Russian lands. In this narrative, he is portrayed as a selfless patriot, a wise and pious ruler who fought tirelessly to defend the Orthodox faith against the pagan steppe and to unify a fractured nation against the selfish ambitions of lesser princes. He is seen as the direct spiritual and political ancestor of the great Muscovite czars like Ivan III and Ivan the Terrible, the first ruler to grasp the historical necessity of autocracy for the survival of the Russian state. His Puchiny is read as the moral charter of this selfless, divinely ordained power. However, a different and more critical interpretation exists, particularly among historians who focus on the earlier, more decentralized traditions of Kievan RUS. From this perspective, Monomakh was not a savior, but a destroyer. He was the man who, through his brilliant and ruthless consolidation of power, fatally undermined the old system of a federation of equals, a system that, for all its flaws, contained a degree of political liberty and regional autonomy. They argue that by concentrating so much power in his own hands and establishing a precedent for passing the grand princely throne directly to his son, he shattered the complex Rurikid succession system and paved the way for the absolutism that would come to define Russian history. In this view, his unification was not a gathering, but a subjugation, and the peace he achieved was the peace of a graveyard for the old Kievan political freedoms. Was he the model Christian prince, the defender of the land? Or was he the first true autocrat, the man who sacrificed liberty for the sake of order, setting the RUS on a path that would lead inexorably to the iron fist of Moscow? The conflict of these interpretations rages on, for in the story of Monomakh, the entire future drama of Russian political history is contained in embryonic form. We can now return to the central dramatic paradox, the core question of our saga. How did a prince, weary of war, create a code of mercy for the RUS? The final, comprehensive answer is that there was no transformation. The warrior did not become a preacher of forgiveness in his old age. The warrior was a preacher of forgiveness from the very beginning, precisely because he was a warrior. Monomakh's code of mercy was not born of saintly idealism or a late-life spiritual awakening. It was the ultimate expression of his brutal, hard-won pragmatism. He was a master strategist, and he had spent a lifetime on the political chessboard, watching his opponents make the same catastrophic, pride-driven mistakes over and over again. He saw that the Rurikid obsession with personal honor, the endless cycle of vengeance and blood feuds, was a strategic absurdity. It was a self-destructive indulgence that weakened the entire land, making it easy prey for the Polovtsians. His pleas for forgiveness, like the incredible letter he wrote to Oleg after the murder of his son, were not the pleas of a turning-the-other-cheek moralist. They were the calculated moves of a grandmaster who understood that a tactical sacrifice, the sacrifice of his own pride and his right to vengeance, was necessary to achieve the ultimate strategic objective, the survival and stability of the RUS state. His Pushchiny is not a work of abstract theology. It is a field manual for sustainable power. He tells his sons to care for the poor and the widow, not just because it is a Christian duty, but because a prince who protects the weakest of his subjects will have a loyal and stable realm, one that is not torn apart by the kind of social uprising he witnessed in Kiev. He warns against killing the innocent and the guilty without due cause, not because he was a modern humanist, but because he knew that arbitrary violence breeds instability and rebellion. He had looked into the abyss of endless war for 60 years, and he had learned that mercy, justice, and forgiveness were not luxuries. They were the most effective, most durable, and most powerful weapons in a ruler's arsenal. The universal lesson of Vladimir Monomakh's life is a profound and unsettling truth about the nature of power and the price of peace. His saga is the story of the terrible burden of the statesman, the tragedy of the leader who must immerse himself in the bloody work of his age in order to transcend it. He teaches us that order is not a natural state of human affairs. It is a fragile, artificial construct, built and maintained at an immense cost. Monomakh's life demonstrates that the most ardent advocate for peace must often be more ruthless, more cunning, and more willing to wield power than the most ambitious warmonger. He sought to create a world based on law and Christian mercy, but to do so, He had to become the most formidable military commander and the most absolute ruler of his generation. He embodies the eternal paradox of the philosopher king, the idea that the only person truly fit to rule is the one who does not desire power, but accepts it as a heavy, joyless duty. His story is a clash of civilizations played out within a single soul. The struggle between the violent, honor-bound ethos of the Viking frontier and the sophisticated, legalistic tradition of Byzantium, between the chaotic freedom of the forest and the disciplined unity required to fight the steppe. He proves that the most compelling arguments for compassion often come not from the mouths of saints in their cells, but from the mouths of old soldiers on their deathbeds, men who have seen enough bloodshed to know its ultimate futility. His life was a testament to the idea that, sometimes, the only way to save a civilization from itself is to impose upon it a will of iron, and that the path to a more merciful world is often paved with the stones of hard and terrible choices. The final frame of this epic saga is a powerful, lingering image, a symbol that encapsulates the entire unresolved paradox of Monomakh's life and legacy. It is the image of the cap of Monomakh, the legendary crown of the Russian czars. For centuries, this beautiful, sable-trimmed, golden filigreed cap was the primary symbol of Russian autocracy. Legend, created by later Muscovite rulers to legitimize their power, claimed it was a gift from a Byzantine emperor directly to Vladimir Monomakh, a tangible link that passed the authority of the Roman Caesars to the rulers of the RUS. While the historical reality is that the cap was made much later and is of Central Asian origin, the power of the myth is what matters. It forever tied his name to the concept of absolute, divinely ordained, imperial power. And so, the final image is this: the heavy, golden cap of Monomakh, gleaming under the candlelight in the Kremlin treasury, a symbol of unchallengeable authority and imperial might. And resting beside it, we imagine a worn, leather-bound manuscript, his Pushini. The script is faded, the pages softened by time, and on them are written the humble, quiet words of the old warrior. Take special care of the poor. Do not kill any man. Have no pride in your heart. The crown and the testament, the symbol of absolute power and the plea for absolute humility. They rest side by side, forever in conflict, forever intertwined. This is the delicious, smoky aftertaste of the kebab. This is the eternal question left by the warrior who preached forgiveness, the shadow of the Grand Prince that looms over the entire, vast, and tragic history of the land he fought so desperately to save.